Here in the UK, the Met Office predicts that a sixth heatwave could potentially hit the UK between late August and mid-September 2026. We've already seen temperatures reach 38.1 Celsius at Kew Gardens. The immediate forecast is cooler, but meteorologists say another spell of significant heat cannot be ruled out as we move into September. And that matters, because this isn't just about how hot it gets. It's about what that heat does to the ground, the landscape, and the risk of wildfire. This summer is on track to be the UK's hottest on record, with 39 days already seeing temperatures exceeding 30 degrees Celsius somewhere in the country. And at the same time, we're seeing major wildfires requiring firefighters, specialist resources, and in some cases, military assistance. As a retired firefighter, that makes me ask a very simple question. Are we preparing our fire service for the world we're actually entering, or are we still organising it around the world we used to live in? Because wildfire doesn't wait for budgets. It doesn't wait for policy. And it certainly doesn't wait for us to catch up. This is the Dave Pamah Show. A global breakdown of how public systems actually work under pressure and why the same failures show up in different places around the world. I'm Dave Pamah, a retired firefighter, and this is where lived experience meets systems reality. Let's get into it. Let's get one thing clear from the beginning. This isn't an episode saying climate change is happening, therefore give the fire service more money. It's more complicated than that. And if you've listened to this podcast before, you know that it's not so much how I approach these issues. I want to understand the system. What is actually happening? Why is it happening? What does the front line experience? And what happens when the demand placed upon a public service changes faster than the service itself? Because that's a real issue. Wildfire is one part of a much bigger change. Firefighters are increasingly dealing with what the NFCC describes as an evolving risk landscape involving climate-driven events, infrastructure, failures, new technologies, and increasingly complex incidents. Phil Carrigan became chair of the National Fire Chiefs Council in April 2025 after 35 years in Merseyside Fire and Rescue Service. When he took the role, he specifically identified increasing risk, climate-related threats, and the growing gap between demand and resource as major challenges for the sector. And the NFCC's 2026 to 2029 strategy is equally clear. Climate impacts are shaping operational risks, while financial constraints and workforce pressures are creating additional strain. So this isn't me inventing a problem. The fire service itself is telling us that the risk landscape is changing. And that's where the conversation needs to start. If you're listening to this from the outside of the UK, let me explain the British situation simply. For many years, the traditional mental image of the British firefighter was a fire engine, a building fire, a road traffic collision, perhaps a chemical incident, and increasingly flooding. But wildfire changes the equation. A building fire is generally contained within a defined environment. You have structure, you have access points, you have known hazards, you establish an incident ground, You develop a tactical plan. You attack the fire. Wildfire is different. The incident ground can become enormous. The fire can change direction. Wind can alter the situation rapidly. Terrain can make access extremely difficult. Vegetation becomes fuel. Dried peat can continue burning underground. And the fire can appear to be under control and then reignite. That last point is incredibly important because the public sees flames. Firefighters see the fire underneath the flames. And with peatland, that's a completely different problem. The South Wales wildfire is a good example. The fire has been burning through peat-covered terrain, making it difficult to extinguish because underground hotspots can continue smouldering and reignite. So imagine trying to deal with that. You're not simply turning up with a hose and putting out a fire. You're managing terrain, fuel, weather, access, resources, fatigue, evacuation, property protection, environmental consequences, and potentially a fire that is measured in thousands of hectares. That's a completely different operational challenge. Now, let's bring this back to the fire service, because here is where the system problem appears. We have a change in risk profile. We also have a service that has been under resource pressure for years. The Fire Brigades Union argues that the number of firefighters has fallen substantially over the past decade and that fire services are now being asked to deal with increasingly climate-related risks with fewer people. And recent reporting has highlighted the same tension. The Financial Times reported that firefighter numbers in England had fallen 41% from their 2009 peak, while fire call-outs had increased and serious fire response times had lengthened. Now, I want to be careful here, because numbers can become political weapons. You can find one statistic and use it to say everything is collapsing, or another statistic and say everything is fine. Neither helps. The real question is, what happens when several major incidents occur simultaneously? That's the test, because emergency services don't operate in a vacuum. If one large wildfire requires dozens or hundreds of firefighters for a prolonged period, those firefighters are not available for something else in exactly the same way. And that's where resilience becomes important. This is something I think public really sees. When you call 999, you don't see the resource map. You don't see the control room. You don't see which appliance are already committed. You don't see how many firefighters are available. You don't see how far away the nearest available appliance is. You don't see whether crews are being moved around in the area. You don't see whether another brigade is being asked to provide assistance. You don't see the fatigue building up amongst crews who've been working for hours. You simply expect the fire service to arrive, and rightly so. That's what you've been promised. But resistance is not simply, can we respond to this incident? It's, can we respond to this incident while still being capable of responding to the next one? That's a completely different question. And wildfires exposes that problem very clearly. Because a wildfire can consume resources for a very long time. It's not necessarily an incident that happens at 2 p.m. and is finished by 4 p.m. It can become a sustained operation. And when you combine that with flooding, heat, road collisions, building fires, and other emergencies, you start to see why climate change is not simply an environmental issue. It becomes an emergency service issue, a public service issue, and ultimately a national resilience issue. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room, climate change. Because we shouldn't pretend that this is simply a matter of better firefighting. It isn't. Firefighters can respond to the consequences, but they cannot, by themselves, solve the conditions creating those consequences. A firefighter can put out the fire. They cannot control the temperature. They cannot create rainfall. They cannot reverse drought. They cannot change global atmospheric conditions. They cannot reduce emissions from industry, transport, or energy systems. That's why prevention has to sit alongside response. And this is where I think the fire service has an extraordinary opportunity. Because firefighters have something that many institutions don't have: public trust. Phil Carrigan himself has spoken about the unique position of trust and respect held by firefighters and the opportunity that gives the service to work with communities and address underlying risks. Think about that. When a politician talks about climate change, some people immediately put up a political shield. When an environmental organisation talks about climate change, some people hear campaigning. But when a firefighter stands in front of a community and says, "Look, this is what we're seeing on the ground," that's different. Because the firefighter isn't necessarily selling an ideology. They're explaining risks. This is where I'm going to make a very practical suggestion. Andy Burnham, if you're listening, speak to Phil Carrigan. Speak to the Fire Brigades Union. Speak to firefighters. And don't just have a meeting about the problem. Build something. Because Greater Manchester is exactly the kind of place where you could test a new approach. Create a properly funded wildfire resilience project. Bring together fire and rescue, local authorities, landowners, forestry, environmental agency, emergency planning, volunteers, communities, scientists, and firefighters, and build an integrated wildfire prevention and response capability. Not just a reaction, I should say, when the fire starts. Before the fire starts, map the risks, identify high-risk areas, improve access, create and maintain fire breaks where appropriate, manage vegetation and fuel, restore damaged peatland, improve early detection, develop community warning systems, train specialist wildfire teams, run joint exercises, and establish mutual aid arrangements before the emergency happens. That's the sort of projects I'm talking about. Not other strategy document, or not another strategy document even. Not another task force. Not another report that sits on a shelf. A practical operational project. Something you can measure. Something you can test. Something you can improve. And this is where I think the fire service could become more powerful. Firefighters could become ambassadors for climate resilience. Now, I'm not suggesting that firefighters become political campaigners. Absolutely not. That's not their style, or not their role, I should say. I'm not talking about education, risk reduction. What I am talking about is education, risk reduction, public engagement. The same principle fires have used for decades with fire safety. We go into communities, we explain risks, we tell people what they can do. We help people understand prevention. Why couldn't that approach be extended? Imagine a firefighter standing in a community hall explaining what makes a wildfire worse. How do you protect your home? What should you do if you're told to evacuate? What should you do if smoke is approaching? How do land management decisions affect wildfire risks? What does drought actually mean? What can communities do? And then the conversation becomes bigger, because climate adaptation isn't just about governments. It's about communities. Now let's leave Britain for a moment, because this is where the pattern becomes obvious. Look at France, look at Spain, look at Greece, look at Canada, look at California, look at Australia. Different countries, different governments, different fire services, different landscapes, but increasingly the same basic problem. Hotter and drier conditions can create more difficult fire conditions. Fuel becomes drier. Fire behaviour becomes more extreme. Communities expand into vulnerable areas. And emergency services have to deal with larger and more complex incidents. This summer, Europe has provided a very stark example. By mid-August 2026, more than 576,000 hectares was reportedly burned across Europe, with Spain, France, Greece, Croatia, Portugal and Belgium among the countries experiencing serious fires. France alone has seen around 50,000 hectares destroyed by recent wildfires, with homes lost and approximately 220,000 people evacuated. Belgium has experienced its largest wildfire on record, with around 3,000 hectares affected in the High Fens. Around 500 firefighters, soldiers, farmers and international aircrafts were involved in the response. Spain has also experienced major fires, with tens of thousands of hectares burned and large-scale evacuations. This isn't one country's problem, it's a system pattern. Now let's go across the Atlantic. Canada. In July, the Canadian government reported 3,137 wildfires during the 2026 season, and around 1.4 million hectares burned at that point in the season. And just days ago, a wildfire in British Columbia forced more than 20,000 people to evacuate. Think about that number. 20,000 people. That's not simply a firefighting problem. That's an evacuation problem, a transport problem. It's a housing problem, a healthcare problem, a communications problem, a medication problem, an economic problem, a mental health problem, an emergency management problem, and eventually a reconstruction problem. This is why I keep saying the emergency is bigger than the fire. The flames are simply the visible part. Then look at California. Cal Fire's current incident data illustrates just how routine large wildfire activity has become there, with thousands of wildfires recorded during 2026 season and hundreds of thousands of acres burned. California has spent years developing sophisticated wildfire systems, aircraft, specialist crews, early warning, evacuation planning, vegetation management, technology, incident command. Yet, even with all of that capability, the underlying problem remains. You cannot simply out firefight an increasingly difficult climate. You have to adapt the entire system. And that is a lesson for Britain. We shouldn't wait until we're California. We shouldn't wait until our wildfire seasons become routinely catastrophic. The time to build resilience is before the system is overwhelmed. And Australia has been living with this for decades. Australia understands something that Britain is increasingly having to understand. Bushfire isn't simply an emergency. It's part of the environment. That changes how you think about prevention, land management, community preparedness, building standards, evacuation, fire behaviour, public education, specialist firefighting, and recovery. The important lesson isn't Britain should copy Australia. Our landscapes and institutions are different. The lesson is, when a risk becomes persistent, you stop treating it as an occasional emergency and start designing the system around it. That's the shift Britain needs to consider. Now, we've heard people use phrases like the new normal, and I understand why. Because I think we need to be careful with that language. Because new normal can become dangerous. If we call something normal, people can start accepting it. And I don't think we should normalise homes burning. We shouldn't normalise communities being evacuated. We shouldn't normalise firefighters being exhausted. We shouldn't normalise emergency services running permanently at the edge of capacity. We shouldn't normalise increasing disaster losses. Instead, I would call it the new risk environment. Because the point isn't to accept it. The point is to adapt to it. And where we can, reduce the drivers making it worse. When I joined the fire service, prevention was a major part of what we did. And rightly so. Because the best fire is the fire that never starts. The principle doesn't disappear because we're dealing with climate change. It becomes more important. But prevention needs to evolve. We need to ask, where are the highest risk wildfire areas? What vegetation exists there? What is happening to the soil? What condition are the peatlands in? Where are communities located? How quickly can people evacuate? Where are the access routes? Can emergency vehicles get there? Where are water supplies? Where are vulnerable people? What happens if several fires start at once? What happens if a wildfire coincides with flooding? What happens if a wildfire coincides with a major heat wave? What happens if the fire service is already committed elsewhere? These are resilience questions. And they're exactly the sort of questions that should be answered before the incident. Let me come back to my proposal. I generally think firefighters could have a much bigger role here. Not as politicians, not as climate activists, as trusted public servants. Imagine a national programme called something like Firefighters for Climate Resilience. And the objective is simple. Reduce risks, educate communities, improve preparedness, support prevention, build public understanding. Every fire service could have trained personnel who works alongside environmental and emergency planning specialists. They could visit schools, community centres, businesses, farms, landowners, housing developments, rural communities, high-risk areas. And the message wouldn't be, vote for this policy. The message would be, here is what the risk is. Here is what we're seeing. Here is what you can do. Here's what we need from the government. Here's what we need from landowners. Here's what we need from communities. That is completely different. Politics still has a role, but not party politics, governance. Because somebody has to decide who pays. Somebody has to decide who is responsible. Somebody has to coordinate. Somebody has to decide what gets prioritised. And this is where public services often struggle. Responsibility gets fragmented. One organisation controls the land. Another controls emergency response. Another controls environmental policy. Another controls funding. And another controls infrastructure. And when everything works, nobody notices. And when something goes wrong, suddenly everyone asks, who was responsible? That's backwards. We should establish responsibility before the crisis. Here's another uncomfortable question. Who pays for wildfire resilience? The fire service? Local government? Central government? Landowners? Environmental agencies? Insurance companies? Or all of them? My answer would be all the stakeholders who benefit from resilience should have a role in funding it. Because if you only fund the emergency response, you're paying for the consequences. If you invest in prevention, you may reduce the consequences. And that's an important distinction. Governments often struggle with prevention because prevention is invisible. Nobody sees the disaster that didn't happen. Nobody gets a headline saying, nothing happened today because we invested in resilience 5 years ago. But that is exactly what good public policy is supposed to do. This is something I learned from emergency services. You can make a service cheaper, but that doesn't necessarily make it the risk cheaper. You can reduce staff. You can close facilities. You can reduce specialist capability. You can change crewing models. You can delay investment. And on paper, you've saved money. But if the risk continues to grow, the cost hasn't disappeared. You've simply moved it elsewhere. It appears later as longer response times, greater property loss, more evacuations, more mutual aid, more overtime, more injuries, more recovery costs, more insurance claims, more pressure on hospitals, more pressure on local authorities, more pressure on communities. So the question shouldn't be, how much does prevention cost? It should be, how much does failure cost? And let me bring this back to firefighters again. Because behind every statistics is a human being. A firefighter standing in smoke. A firefighter working in extreme heat. A firefighter walking difficult terrain. A firefighter trying to protect someone's home. A firefighter who hasn't had enough rest. A firefighter wondering whether the next call will come before they've properly recovered from the last one. We sometimes talk about firefighters as if they are unlimited resource. They're not. They are human beings. And if we're going to increase the demands placed upon them, We need to increase the support around them. Training, equipment, crewing, welfare, specialist knowledge, research, technology, and most importantly, time to recover. Because resilience doesn't mean squeezing more out of people. It means designing a system that can continue functioning when the pressure increases. And this is where I think the wildfire story teaches us something much bigger. We often design public services around yesterday's problems. Then the environment changes. But the institution changes slowly. That's the problem. Climate change doesn't wait for a 5-year strategy. Wildfire doesn't wait for a procurement process. Flooding doesn't wait for a funding settlement. Heatwaves don't wait for a workforce reform. Risk moves faster than bureaucracy. And that creates a dangerous gap. The gap between what we know is coming and what we're prepared to deal with. That gap is where disaster lives. So, what would I actually like to see? Not another political argument, not another blame game, not another debate about whether one government spent more or less than another. I'd like to see a national wildfire resilience program, a genuine one, a long-term, operational, evidence-based, and involving the people who actually understand fire behaviour. Firefighters, land managers, foresters, environmental scientists, emergency planners, local authorities, communities, and national government. Let's identify the highest risk areas. Let's develop specialist capability. Let's improve training. Let's improve equipment. Let's establish national mutual aid. Let's improve early warning. Let's invest in land management. Let's protect peatlands. Let's improve public education. Let's test evacuation plans. Let's exercise them. And let's measure whether the system is actually becoming more resilient. That's leadership. But there's one more thing. We can't fight our way out of climate change. We can adapt. We can prepare. We can reduce risks. But we also have to address the cause. Because otherwise, we're building a larger emergency response to an increasingly difficult environment. That's not sustainable. And this is where the fire service's voice could be extremely powerful. Not political, not political at all. Professional. Firefighters can say, we're seeing the consequences. We're responding to the consequences. And here's what those consequences mean for communities. That's a powerful message, because climate change isn't an abstract scientific argument when you're standing in front of a burned out home. It isn't abstract when a community has been evacuated. It isn't abstract when a firefighter has spent 3 weeks fighting a peat fire. It isn't abstract when a country has to evacuate tens of thousands of people. The consequences are physical, they're human, and increasingly, they're operational. This is the biggest lesson I want people to take away from today's episode. We shouldn't wait until Britain experienced a wildfire disaster on the scale of the worst incidents we've seen internationally. Because by then, the question won't be, should we prepare? It will be, why didn't we prepare? And I've heard that question throughout emergency services. Why weren't we ready? Why didn't we have enough people? Why wasn't the equipment there? Why wasn't the access route clear? Why didn't the agencies communicate? Why didn't somebody act earlier? Those questions are always easier to answer before the emergency. And I want to make this absolutely clear. I'm not arguing that government can solve everything. It can't. I'm not arguing that firefighters can solve everything. They can't. I'm not arguing that communities can solve everything. They can't. This is a systems problem. Government has a responsibility. Fire services have a responsibility. Landowners have a responsibility. Businesses have a responsibilities. Communities have a responsibilities. And individuals have a responsibility. And climate policy has a responsibility. The trick is making those responsibilities connect, because disconnected systems are fragile systems. And that's why I wanted to take this conversation beyond Britain. Because if you look at Britain alone, you might think we have a wildfire problem. But look globally. Canada, California, Australia, Spain, France, Greece. The same pattern keeps appearing. Climate conditions change. Risk increases. Communities remain exposed. Emergency services responds. Resources become stretched. Government spends enormous amounts of dealing with consequences. Then everybody asks how it happened. That is the pattern. And that's why this isn't really a wildfire story. It's a story about how societies prepare for changing risks. So I want to return to Phil Carrigan. He has already identified the central challenge: increasing risks, changing climates, growing demands, resource pressures, and the need for the fire service to be fit for the future. That's the conversation we need. And I'd like to see the NFCC, government, and the FBU and local fire authorities move this from discussion into delivery. Because there is a huge opportunity here. The fire service doesn't just have expertise in responding to emergencies. It understands risks. It understands human behavior. It understands communities. It understands prevention. And it understands what happens when prevention fails. That's incredible, valuable knowledge. So here's my challenge. To Phil Carrigan, keep pushing the wildfire strategy, but make it practical. To the Fire Brigades Union, keep highlighting workforce pressures, but also bring firefighters into the national conversation about climate resilience. To Andy Burnham, bring people together. Don't wait for another major incident. Build a Greater Manchester model that can actually demonstrate what integrated wildfire resilience look like. And to government, don't just fund the response, fund prevention, fund people, fund training, fund equipment, fund research, fund resilience. And to the public, don't leave this entirely to firefighters, because firefighters can't prevent every fire. They can't control the weather. They can't change how land is managed, and they can't reduce global emissions on their own. But we can all contribute to reducing risks. I've been out of the fire service for years now, but once you've been a firefighter, you don't completely stop thinking like one. You still look at risks. You still notice exits. You still think about access. You still think, what's going to happen if this goes wrong? And perhaps that's why this subject bothers me. Because I can see the direction of travel. And I don't think the answer is panic. I don't think the answer is doom. I don't think the answer is political shouting. The answer is preparation. Good leadership. Good science. Good operational planning. Good public services. And communities that understands the risk they face. So perhaps the biggest question isn't how many wildfires are we going to have? Perhaps it's what kind of society are we going to build around the risks we know are coming? Because the fire is only one part of the story. The other part is everything around it. The firefighter, the family, the community, the emergency control room, the ambulance, the police, the local authority, the landowner, the government, the environment, the economy, excuse me, and the climate, all connected. And when one part of that becomes overwhelmed, the pressure moves somewhere else. And that's what systems do. Pressure doesn't disappear, it moves. And that's why resilience matters. We can't stop every wildfire. We can't control every drought. We can't eliminate every climate risks. But we can decide whether we're going to be prepared. We can decide whether we're going to invest before the emergency. Sorry. We can decide whether we're going to listen to the people who are actually seeing the changes on the front line. And we can decide whether firefighters are simply going to be the people who arrive when everything has already gone wrong. Or whether we use their unique positions in society to help prevent some of those failures in the first place. Because the best emergency response is still prevention. And sometimes prevention starts with somebody being willing to say, the risk has changed. Now, we need to change with it. Because whether it's here in the UK or anywhere else in the world, these systems don't fail in isolation. They fail in patterns. And once you understand the patterns, you start to see it everywhere. This is the Dave Pamah Show.